Craig, do you think the recent release of the exposure draft of the national finance broking legislation will increase consumer confidence in the reverse mortgages or equity sector?
I believe that the draft legislation that's been put out recently will definitely have the effect, once it comes in, of increasing consumer confidence in the market, because at the moment, even though a great deal has been done by the industry to self-regulate, broadly speaking, the mortgage market is seen as unregulated. And unregulated in many cases equals Wild West. So because while it remains unregulated, we are attracting attention to ourselves, despite the fact that we may have very high standards of self-regulation. So I do believe that the legislation, when it comes in, will be very beneficial from a consumer perspective. Embedded into that legislation is going to be some very specific requirements for reverse mortgages.
And is this draft legislation state or federal based?
An interesting point allied to the launch of the draft legislation is the fact that there is a parallel movement, if you could call it that. There are some people in the industry who are looking for federal legislation. So whilst we've got the draft legislation on the table at the moment that happens to be state-based, meaning that if it's successful, New South Wales will legislate a regulation, as will Victoria, as will South Australia, etc. We will have a uniform legislation on a state-based level. The other way of doing this would be to have federal legislation. And there is some very good points in favour of both. In favour of federal legislation is the fact that it is uniformly national anyway. It would also then begin to mirror the sorts of legislation that affects financial planners, rather than having a combination of federal and state legislation covering financial planning and broking. The other point to bear in mind is that with a state-based legislation program, the time frame is going to probably be longer, because when you're dealing with state-based legislatures, the possibility of having delays is far more likely than if you're having a federal-based legislation. So I don't necessarily think that legislation is going to happen probably even in 2008. I think that the draft exposure will be commented on. I think that there will be a review process through 2008, and at the same time that that's happening, there are going to be those people campaigning for a federal solution. So yes, legislation is required. I think it's positive. Those people in the industry who are professionals and who conduct themselves at the highest standards will probably find that the legislation, be it state or federal, will more than likely reflect what those particular practitioners are already doing. And in that regard, we need to be mindful of the efforts of bodies like the MFAA and SQL, because those two bodies and other bodies have made it their business to, on a self-regulatory basis, raise the standards of practitioners, mindful that in due course legislation will come. But because the industry is so well self-regulated at the moment, it's not going to be a major difficulty accepting that legislation or even complying with it.
So in light of another 3 brokers being expelled by the MFAA in the last fortnight, do you think the proposal of this legislation will work to protect borrowers further, and in doing so lift the current standard of the broking industry in Australia?
Look, there's no doubt that a piece of legislation designed as consumer protection is going to be welcomed, not only by the consumers, but also by people in the industry who work at professional standards. So although it's not necessarily good news to have colleagues in an industry expelled, what we don't want is to have rogue operators, and legislation allows authorities and industry bodies to discipline rogue operators. So I think you'd find a universal support of measures that expel operators like that. And I think that if the public become aware that there is legislation in place, that if there is a substandard operator working in an area, that they will be found and they will be prosecuted and they will be required to leave the industry, that can only make make consumers feel more confident, and it can only be positive for the industry.